This one biological mechanism shuts off hunger for 24 hours and speeds up metabolism. You are eating less than you used to, you are watching what goes on your plate, and somewhere inside the daily discipline of all that restraint, you believe your body is working with you. It is not. There is a specific hormonal mechanism running silently inside your gut right now that is generating hunger signals. Your brain cannot distinguish from genuine starvation, firing them on a schedule that has nothing to do with how many calories you consumed, and resetting your metabolic rate downward every time it cycles through. Not because your willpower is insufficient, not because you chose the wrong diet. Because a peptide called ghrelin has been operating on a rhythm your eating schedule has been training for months or years, and almost nothing in mainstream nutrition content ever explains how that rhythm works, how it compounds over time, or what it takes to actually interrupt it. The mechanism that shuts it down is not portion control. It is not willpower. It is a precise, timed biological reset that takes between 16 and 24 hours to complete, produces measurable changes in ghrelin, leptin, and a second hunger-regulating peptide called peptide YY, and leaves a metabolic signature in blood chemistry that researchers at the Salk Institute, Stanford, and the National Institutes of Health have been documenting for over a decade. Most people watching content about weight loss and metabolic health have never heard this mechanism explained accurately. By the time you finish this video, you will understand it better than most general practitioners who were never trained on the circadian endocrinology behind appetite regulation. Here is what is happening in your body right now, regardless of when you last ate. Ghrelin is a peptide hormone manufactured primarily in a cluster of cells lining the inner wall of your stomach called the oxyntic gland cells. It was discovered in 1999 by Masayasu Kojima and his colleagues at the National Cardiovascular Center Research Institute in Osaka, Japan. The original paper was published in Nature, and it described ghrelin as the first known hormone produced in the stomach that acts directly on the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus to stimulate appetite and drive caloric intake. The basic function most people know about ghrelin is that it rises before meals and falls after meals. That part is true. What almost no one in popular health content ever explains is what controls when it rises. Ghrelin does not rise because you are hungry. Hunger is what you feel after it rises. The sequence matters. Ghrelin rises on a schedule. That schedule is partly circadian, driven by your biological clock, and partly conditioned, shaped by the specific meal timing you have been repeating for months. Research from the laboratory of Scott Ritter at Washington State University and independently from a group led by Karel Leroux at University College Dublin, has documented that ghrelin secretion anticipates meals based on learned timing patterns. Your stomach is not responding to hunger, it is generating hunger according to a timetable you trained it to follow, often without realizing it. If you have been eating lunch at noon for the last 2 years, your oxyntic cells have been set to begin releasing ghrelin at approximately 11:45 every single day, with a precision that would embarrass most alarm clocks. That is not metaphor. That is the documented biology of a conditioned ghrelin pattern. The reason this matters, and the reason it explains the hunger problem that portion control never solves, is that conditioned ghrelin rises are not proportional to caloric deficit. They are proportional to habit strength. A person who has been eating a mid-morning snack at 10:30 every weekday for 18 months will experience a ghrelin surge at 10:15 on a day when they consumed a completely adequate breakfast 2 hours earlier and have zero physiological need for additional calories. The surge is real. The hunger it produces is indistinguishable to the brain from genuine starvation-level hunger. The brain receives the same chemical signal whether the stomach is actually empty or whether the ghrelin clock has simply cycled to its trained release time. This is why dietary discipline feels like fighting the ocean with a bucket. The signal is not a soft suggestion from a mildly uncomfortable stomach. It is a hormonal command generated by a rhythm the body has been practicing for years, arriving on schedule regardless of what you ate an hour ago. Now, here is the layer almost nobody in popular nutrition content ever reaches. Ghrelin does not operate alone. It is the lead instrument in an appetite orchestra that includes at minimum 4 other major players. Leptin, which signals satiety and energy sufficiency from your fat tissue. Peptide YY, which is released from cells in the small intestine and colon after eating and produces satiety signals that suppress appetite for 2 to 4 hours. Glucagon-like peptide 1, secreted from the gut wall in response to specific nutrients and associated with powerful satiety and metabolic rate regulation, and neuropeptide Y, the brain's appetite amplifier that ghrelin activates when it reaches the hypothalamus, and that, once activated, continues driving hunger even after ghrelin levels fall. The fitness and wellness industry talks about ghrelin in isolation, the way someone would describe traffic by only watching one intersection. The problem is the entire highway system. In a person with a well-calibrated appetite system, these 5 signals operate in coordinated rhythm. Ghrelin rises before meals, falls after meals, and the satiety signals produced by leptin and peptide YY provide a sustained suppression that bridges comfortably to the next meal. Hunger is predictable, manageable, and proportionate to actual energy need. In a person who has been cycling through yo-yo dieting, has been eating on irregular schedules, is carrying significant visceral fat, or is past the age of 45, the orchestra has gone out of tune in specific and documentable ways. Leptin resistance, the condition where the brain stops responding normally to leptin satiety signal even when levels are adequate, affects a substantial proportion of adults who have tried and failed to maintain weight loss. A 2022 review in Nature Reviews Endocrinology by Kirsty Spalding and colleagues at the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm found that in adipose-heavy adults, leptin resistance is not a production problem. The fat cells are making enough leptin. The hypothalamus has stopped receiving the signal clearly. The satiety signal exists. The receiver is broken. The consequence is not just that you feel hungrier more often. Ghrelin, operating without its natural counterweight, produces hunger signals of greater amplitude and longer duration. The volume knob on your appetite system is stuck at 8. You eat, leptin rises, your hypothalamus does not hear it clearly, ghrelin rebounds faster than it should, and 30 minutes after a calorie-adequate meal, you feel a hunger signal the brain interprets as real and pressing. This is not weakness. This is broken signaling hardware. And the most important thing you can understand about broken appetite signaling is that you cannot out-discipline it. Willpower is a cortical function. Ghrelin-driven hunger is a hypothalamic drive, older, faster, and operating several layers below the brain structures that make rational decisions. Telling someone with leptin resistance and a conditioned ghrelin pattern to eat less through discipline alone is equivalent to telling someone to override their breathing reflex through concentration. The hierarchy of brain function does not work that way. This is the part of the story that should produce a specific kind of frustration, and I want to name it directly. It is not frustration at yourself. Every American who has been told that weight management is primarily a personal responsibility problem, a discipline problem, a character problem, has been given a framework designed by an industry that profits from repeat customers, not from solved problems. The supplement market in the United States generates over $50 billion per year, according to data from the Council for Responsible Nutrition. The commercial diet industry adds another $72 billion, according to market research published by Research and Markets in 2023. Those numbers require that solutions fail slowly, not succeed permanently. The biology of appetite regulation, the actual mechanism of how ghrelin cycles, how leptin resistance develops, how conditioned hunger patterns compound over years, this information has been sitting in peer-reviewed endocrinology journals for 25 years. It is not discussed in diet program marketing because a program that correctly explains how appetite hormones work would have to tell its customers that the approach being sold will not address the mechanism driving the hunger the customer is trying to overcome. For anyone over 50 watching this, there is an additional physiological layer that makes conditioned ghrelin patterns more damaging and harder to disrupt. Ghrelin sensitivity, meaning how powerfully the brain's appetite centers respond to circulating ghrelin, increases with age. Research from the University of Washington's Nutritional Sciences Department, published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, found that adults over 50 show a measurably stronger appetite-stimulating response per unit of ghrelin than adults in their 30s, even when circulating ghrelin levels are identical. The same amount of ghrelin produces more hunger after 50. The volume knob on the ghrelin amplifier gets more sensitive as you age, not less. Most of the research that justifies the generic eat less, move more framework was conducted on younger, metabolically healthier adult populations whose appetite systems were not operating under the compounded disadvantages of age-related hormonal shifts, years of dieting-induced leptin resistance, and conditioned ghrelin patterns built through decades of irregular eating. Those studies do not describe your biology after 50. The mechanism that actually resets this system is called the GRIP protocol. It has 3 components, each with a precise time window attached and one mistake that invalidates all 3 if you make it. I will give you the full protocol by the end of this video. But first, I need to walk you through what happens inside your gut during the 16 to 24-hour reset window. Because understanding the mechanism is what separates following a protocol temporarily from understanding it permanently. Hour 0. You finish your last meal. The clock starts from the final bite. Your gut is still processing what you consumed, your pancreas is releasing insulin in response to glucose entering the bloodstream, and ghrelin is at its post-meal low. Your oxinic cells have temporarily quieted, but they are already recalibrating toward the next scheduled release. Think of this stage as a factory floor that just shipped a production run. The machines are cooling down, but the foreman is already reviewing the schedule for the next batch. And the clock on the wall is what matters, not how much raw material is in the warehouse. Hour 2 to hour 4. Gut absorption is mostly complete. Blood glucose is falling. Insulin is declining. Almost no fasting content addresses this. Ghrelin does not immediately rebound just because insulin is falling. There is a suppression window where ghrelin remains relatively low after a calorie-adequate meal. Stretch receptors in the stomach wall send signals through the vagus nerve to the brainstem that temporarily suppress oxyntic cell activity. This is the only window in a typical eating day where the ghrelin factory is running at measurably reduced output for a reason unrelated to timing. The moment stomach distension resolves, which happens within 2 to 4 hours, that physical suppression is gone. Hour 6. For most Americans, this is a normal overnight gap between a late dinner and a morning meal, and the body treats it that way. A routine intermeal interval, not a signal for any meaningful metabolic shift. Liver glycogen stores are still largely intact. Blood glucose is being maintained by the liver releasing glucose from those stores at a controlled rate. Insulin is low but not at floor level. Ghrelin is beginning its morning climb, driven by the circadian clock, and if you have been eating breakfast routinely for years, by the conditioned anticipation of food arriving soon. The hunger you feel between 6 and 8 in the morning if you routinely eat breakfast is not your body signaling that it needs fuel. It is your oxyntic cells releasing ghrelin on a schedule they have been practicing for decades. Hour 8. Liver glycogen depletion is accelerating. The body is increasingly drawing on fat stores through lipolysis, the enzymatic breakdown of triglycerides into free fatty acids that cells can use for energy. But the precise biological condition required for lipolysis at full capacity is this. Insulin must be at its floor, and glucagon, the opposing hormone that signals scarcity, must be meaningfully elevated. By hour 8, insulin is trending that way, but the body has not committed to fat as its primary fuel source. The factory has acknowledged that no new shipment is arriving today. It has not yet activated the protocol for drawing from long-term reserves. Hour 10, the conditioned ghrelin peak for anyone who has historically eaten lunch around noon is approaching. Your body has not yet unlocked the hormonal mechanisms that suppress appetite through extended fasting because 10 hours is not long enough for those mechanisms to engage at meaningful levels. But your oxyntic cells are firing on schedule, producing a ghrelin surge that has nothing to do with actual fuel depletion and everything to do with learned meal timing. The peak you experience around hour 10 is not the universal peak popular fasting content describes. It is your specific conditioned peak, the one your history built. And it is the hardest to sit through because it arrives before the biology that would naturally suppress it has had time to activate. Hour 12. Liver glycogen approaches depletion. The liver, running low on its direct glucose supply, forces a categorical shift. It begins converting free fatty acids into ketone bodies, specifically acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, and acetone. Ketones are not a diet marketing concept. They are an ancient survival fuel your brain, heart, and major organs can run on when glucose supply falls below the threshold required to meet their energy demands. Measurable ketones begin appearing in blood between hour 12 and hour 14, depending on metabolic flexibility. Think of this stage as the body shifting from burning the logs stacked by the fireplace to beginning to draw from the woodpile stored out back. The decision to open the woodpile has been made. The logistics of getting the fuel inside are underway. Hour 14. Here is the first window where something categorically different begins to happen to ghrelin specifically. Research from the laboratory of Yiying Zhang at Columbia University Medical Center, published in Cell Metabolism, documented a measurable suppression of circulating ghrelin at approximately 14 hours into a fast, driven not by caloric intake but by elevated ketone levels acting directly on the hypothalamus. Beta hydroxybutyrate has been shown to suppress appetite centers through a mechanism that does not require insulin and does not depend on stomach distension. The free fatty acids circulating at high concentration by hour 14 also contribute to peptide YY release from the small intestine, generating a satiety signal from a completely different pathway than the one that generates post-meal satiety. The conditioned ghrelin clock is still operating, but now there is a competing signal coming from a direction the conditioned pattern has no influence over. Hour 16. This is the threshold most fasting content treats as the destination, and here is the mainstream betrayal that costs millions of people the majority of what they were trying to achieve. The popular 16-hour guideline was derived from studies examining autophagy and general metabolic improvement compared to no fasting at all. Those comparisons showed benefit, but the specific studies on ghrelin resetting tell a categorically different story. A 2019 paper from the lab of David Cummings at the University of Washington examined ghrelin pulsatility patterns across fasting durations in adult subjects ranging from 35 to 60 years old. The finding, the conditioned ghrelin pulse does not measurably attenuate until fasting duration crosses 18 hours. At 16 hours, the conditioned pattern is still firing on schedule. It is competing with rising ketones and elevated peptide YY, which is why hunger is more manageable at hour 16 than at hour 10. But the pattern itself has not been disrupted. A 16-hour fast will improve fat oxidation and insulin sensitivity. It will not recalibrate the conditioned ghrelin pattern that produces the hunger driving you back to food on schedule. 16 hours parks in the lot, 18 hours walks through the door, hour 18. Two converging biological events happen here that do not occur at hour 16. The first is what Cummings' lab documented as the attenuation inflection point, the window where the conditioned ghrelin pulse begins to measurably desynchronize from the clock that trained it. At hour 18, the oxyntic cells that have been firing at trained mealtime intervals begin receiving a sustained hormonal environment so different from normal eating that the conditioned schedule starts to lose its anchoring. The pulsatile pattern, the sharp anticipatory surge that arrives on schedule regardless of hunger, begins to flatten. This is not ghrelin being suppressed by a competing signal. This is the pattern itself starting to lose coherence. The factory foreman has been reading the same schedule every hour for years. At hour 18, the schedule starts to smear. The second event is the meaningful elevation of human growth hormone, or HGH. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Investigation has documented that HGH rises sharply during extended fasting, with the steepest portion occurring between hours 17 and 24. HGH matters here not just for fat mobilization, but for the direct suppression of ghrelin synthesis it produces. HGH acts on the oxyntic cells in the stomach wall and reduces their ghrelin production through a pathway independent of insulin, ketones, and stomach distension. For anyone over 50, HGH production declines significantly with age. The magnitude of HGH elevation during extended fasting in adults over 50 is smaller than in younger adults, but it is clinically meaningful, and it is the primary reason a properly executed extended fast produces appetite recalibration that shorter fasting windows simply cannot replicate. I want to step back from the mechanism here for a moment. After my own blood panel came back about 4 years ago with numbers my doctor described using words I had to look up, I started fasting like most people do. 16-hour windows, consistently, and my markers improved. I was convinced I had found the protocol. It was not until I went deeper into Cummings' work on ghrelin pulsatility that I realized I had been running a protocol that was improving my metabolism while leaving the hunger pattern that drove my overeating completely intact. The hunger was quieter because insulin was lower and ketones were higher. But the clock was still ticking. I was managing the symptom. I had not addressed the mechanism. Shifting to an 18-hour window with specific changes to my last meal composition produced a change in my hunger experience over the following 3 weeks that was qualitatively different. The scheduled hunger, the 10:30 alarm, the noon alarm started arriving softer. then late, then on some days not at all. That is not an anecdote about willpower. That is the ghrelin pulsatility pattern losing its training. Individual results vary, and physician oversight of any extended fasting protocol is not optional. But the mechanism lands differently when you have felt it working. Hour 20. Fat oxidation is at its highest rate of the cycle. Blood ketone concentration in most metabolically flexible adults reaches its daily peak between hours 20 and 22. Autophagy, the cellular self-cleaning mechanism that begins around hour 14, is operating at peak measured activity in the 20 to 24-hour window, based on white blood cell markers in fasting subjects from the Buck Institute for Research on Aging and the University of Southern California's Longevity Institute. For anyone over 50, this matters because baseline autophagy declines with age in documented ways. Age-related reductions in autophagic activity contribute to the accumulation of damaged proteins that drive chronic disease across multiple organ systems. The hunger clock at hour 20 has been running without a scheduled refueling event long enough that the conditioned pattern has begun its measurable disruption. The appetite orchestra is not silent, but for the first time in months or years, ghrelin is not the conductor. Now you have watched the full timeline. You have seen what your body does from hour 0 through hour 20, why the conditioned ghrelin pattern fires when it does, why 16 hours is not enough to disrupt it, and where the two converging events at hour 18 produce something qualitatively different. The GRIP protocol is the answer: 4 letters, 3 actionable components, and 1 mistake that invalidates all 3 if you walk into it without knowing it is there. The G stands for ghrelin gap management, which means controlling the composition of your last meal to accelerate the hormonal transition into the fasting state and reduce the amplitude of the conditioned ghrelin surge you will face at hour 10. Almost every popular fasting guide is silent on this variable. Research from Krista Varadi's lab at the University of Illinois Chicago, examining pre-fast meal composition, consistently shows that a final meal high in refined carbohydrates produces an insulin elevation that can last 4 to 6 hours past the last bite in individuals with any degree of insulin resistance. If your last meal produces a 6-hour insulin elevation, and insulin directly suppresses the fat oxidizing and ketone producing pathways that eventually compete with the conditioned ghrelin signal, then the first 6 hours of your supposed fast are not metabolically a fast at all. You are in the fed state with the factory doors open while the clock says you are fasting. The specific pre-fast meal target is 30 to 40 grams of high-quality protein, moderate fat from whole food sources such as eggs, olive oil, or avocado, and no more than 20% of total meal calories from carbohydrate, with those carbohydrates coming exclusively from high-fiber vegetables rather than refined starch or simple sugar. Protein stimulates insulin release, but simultaneously stimulates glucagon. The net effect of a protein-dominant meal on insulin is substantially blunted compared to a carbohydrate-dominant meal of identical calories. Dietary fat barely stimulates insulin at all. A last meal structured at approximately 40% protein, 40% fat, and 20% high-fiber carbohydrate can return insulin to fasting baseline 90 minutes to 2 hours faster than a standard high-carbohydrate dinner of identical caloric content. That is the difference between arriving at the hour 18 threshold in a metabolically committed fasting state versus arriving there still partially in transition. The R stands for reach 18 hours before breaking the fast and protect that final window from the 4 behaviors that most commonly prevent people from crossing it. The first is flavored beverages of any kind during the fasting window. Flavored sparkling water containing citric acid can trigger a cephalic phase insulin response in some individuals, a small but real anticipatory insulin release triggered by the taste signal reaching the brain before any glucose arrives. This response has been documented in multiple human studies and in a 2020 meta-analysis published in Physiology and Behavior. The magnitude varies between people and between sweeteners, but during hours 16 to 18, when your body is approaching the ghrelin attenuation threshold, even a modest insulin tick can interrupt the hormonal convergence that makes that window productive. The second behavior is branched-chain amino acid supplementation sold as fasting-safe workout support. Free-form amino acids, particularly leucine, activate the mTOR pathway and interrupt the metabolic fasting state with measurable speed. The third is fruit juice, including small quantities. Fructose and glucose delivered into the portal blood supply at hour 16 or 17 represents a complete restart of the postprandial cycle at the exact moment the grilling attenuation process has just crossed into its productive range. The fourth behavior is the one most people push back on: artificial sweeteners. The claim that zero-calorie sweeteners are fast-preserving because they contain no glucose is a claim about the insulin index, not the full range of metabolic effects. The cephalic phase insulin response, the anticipatory insulin release triggered by sweet taste reaching the brain before any caloric content arrives, has been documented for both natural and artificial sweeteners in peer-reviewed literature. I am not telling you that artificial sweeteners universally break a fast for everyone. I am telling you that during hours 16 to 18, when the conditioned ghrelin pattern is beginning to desynchronize and HGH is starting its steepest rise, the risk of a small insulin event carrying outsized consequences is higher than at any other point in the fasting cycle. Black coffee, plain tea, and unflavored water are the only reliably safe beverages during this window. The I stands for insulin floor preservation at meal 1, which means the composition of the first meal after the fast determines whether you consolidate the ghrelin recalibration the extended fast just produced or immediately erase it. The most common mistake at meal 1 is breaking the fast with rapidly digesting carbohydrates. A piece of fruit, a smoothie built around banana or dates, a bowl of oatmeal with honey. These feel like clean post-fast choices. They produce a sharp insulin spike that terminates fat oxidation almost immediately and sends a high glucose delivery signal to the oxyntic cells that just spent several hours losing their conditioned timing. A carbohydrate-driven insulin spike after an 18 to 20-hour fast is the biological equivalent of a fire alarm going off in a factory that has been in lockdown for 18 hours. Everything that had been quieting reactivates at full volume. Varadi's clinical trials at the University of Illinois Chicago support breaking the fast with 25 to 40 grams of protein before introducing significant carbohydrate. Protein stimulates mTOR and initiates muscle protein synthesis at the precise moment when HGH levels are still elevated from the extended fast. For anyone over 50, this matters because muscle protein synthesis efficiency declines with age. Protein at meal 1 before carbohydrates extends the metabolic benefit of the 18-hour window by 30 to 60 minutes while protecting the lean tissue the protocol worked to preserve. The P stands for pattern consistency. The ghrelin pulsatility pattern was trained by repetition. It cannot be disrupted by a single extended fast. Data from Sakyan Panda's lab at the Salk Institute tracking real-world, time-restricted eating adherence showed that participants with more than 60 minutes of window variation across days showed significantly attenuated metabolic benefits compared to participants who maintained consistent timing. For ghrelin specifically, the pulsatility literature suggests that meaningful desynchronization of the conditioned pattern requires approximately 10 to 14 consecutive days of consistent 18-hour windows to produce a measurable reduction in peak ghrelin amplitude during the trained mealtime hours. A single extended fast produces the biological conditions for disruption. Consistent repetition is what completes it. People who run the GRIP protocol Sunday through Thursday and eat freely on Friday and Saturday are not simply losing 2 days of progress. They are actively retraining the conditioned ghrelin pattern back toward the irregular schedule that produced the problem. The minimum effective consistency for meaningful ghrelin recalibration appears to be 5 days per week of on-protocol behavior, with no more than 60 minutes of window variation on the remaining 2 days. This is not 7 days of perfect adherence. It is not an all-or-nothing requirement. It is a biological minimum below which the repetition signal is not strong enough to override the existing conditioning. The mistake that invalidates all 4 components of the GRIP protocol is treating the fast as a daily event, rather than a circadian one. These mechanisms are not activated by duration alone. They are activated by duration timed to your circadian biology. A person running an 18-hour fast that ends at 2 in the morning is not producing the same physiological outcome as one ending at noon. The pancreatic beta cell function, insulin receptor sensitivity, and oxyntic cell responsiveness to hormonal suppression signals all follow circadian rhythms that peak in the morning and decline through the evening. The Sutton 2018 study in cell metabolism found clinically meaningful differences in insulin sensitivity, fat oxidation, and inflammatory markers between an early eating window and a late day one, even when total calories were identical. The food was the same. The timing was different. The outcomes were categorically different. HGH secretion is higher during the day than at night in response to fasting in most adults. Running an 18-hour fast without timing it to circadian biology is running the protocol with its most powerful component at half capacity. The full grip protocol in daily structure. Your eating window closes by 7 in the evening. Your final meal is roughly 40% protein, 40% fat, and 20% high fiber carbohydrate, with zero refined sugar or simple starch. Your fast runs from meal close to a window opening between noon and 1 the following day, hitting the 18 to 20 hour mark. During the fasting window, you consume only black coffee, plain tea, and unflavored water. You break the fast with 25 to 40 grams of protein before introducing carbohydrates. You repeat this on at least 5 days per week with no more than 60 minutes of window variation. Applied consistently over 10 to 14 days, this protocol produces measurable changes in ghrelin pulsatility that do not occur with shorter fasting windows, less consistent implementation, or any version that ignores the circadian timing component. If you are going to start the GRIP protocol this week, comment GRIP below so I can see who is actually moving on this. I read every comment, and in 2 weeks I will follow up with data on which protein sources at meal 1 produce the cleanest mTOR activation without the insulin spike that erases the final hours of the fast. If this is the kind of content you want, no shortcuts, no motivational filler, every claim sourced and every mechanism explained, subscribe to the channel. That is the single most direct way to make sure the next video, which covers the one circadian timing variable that determines whether the GRIP protocol recalibrates your ghrelin clock in 10 days or 30, reaches you when it goes up